everyone, and welcome. My name is Allison Purgel, and I'm the lead librarian at the Norton Shores branch of the Muskegon Area District Library. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome you tonight as the library celebrates Women's History Month this March by learning about the ladies of the lights, those women before their time who took on the romantic yet dangerous and physically demanding job of tending to the beacons that protected the shoreline. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this evening. I would now like to introduce tonight's speaker, Dianna Stampfler. Dianna has been referred to as one of the most motivated, energetic, and passionate leaders in Michigan's tourism industry, with more than 25 years of marketing, public relations, and media relations experience. Author is another official title for Dianna, as she is a regular contributor to various different magazine publications, and her book titled Michigan's Haunted Lighthouses was published in 2019. Well, I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has to share tonight about the ladies of the lights. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Dianna.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to take a minute here to do my technological updates on this side. Get the screen. There we go. Get it sharing. Hopefully everyone can see that. I am super excited to be presenting this presentation tonight as part of Women's History Month. Just a little bit more of my background. I was born and raised in Allegan County, went to Western Michigan University, and I really started to understand the significance of lighthouses and the contributions that Lighthouse Keepers gave here in Michigan, particularly in the late 1990s when I was working for a group in Grand Rapids called the West Michigan Tourist Association. And at that time, they still do, but they were publishing a map in a magazine called the Lake Michigan Circle Tour, which if you're from the Muskegon area, you're probably very familiar with the green Lake Michigan Circle Tour signs there along the shoreline. And my first job with them was to catalog all of the lighthouses on Lake Michigan. So I had a spreadsheet and I had a list of lights and the cities that they were in. And I had to go and find out when it was built, if it was rebuilt or modified or extended or whatnot, how tall the tower was, if it was an active light, did they have a museum? Could you climb the tower? Was there a gift shop? Did it have a bed and breakfast or an opportunity to spend the night like some of the keeper programs offer? And there were also two common themes that really came up during that early research. One, as Allison noted, haunted lighthouses were a big deal. And so I became quite fascinated with those stories. But I was also finding, as I was talking to the museums and the communities that had these lights, and determining that there were a lot of women involved in the lighthouse service here in Michigan, and also I learned later around the country. And it's really significant to have these women working in the lighthouse service. Now, Michigan has more lighthouses than any other state. We have about 130 lights. The earliest light was built in the 1820s before Michigan ever became a state, and that was the Fort Gratiot Lighthouse in Fort Huron over on Lake Huron. And our first female keeper was hired in 1849, also over in on Lake Huron. But these lighthouses were established through the U.S. Lighthouse Service. They were government jobs. The appointments often came down from the President of the United States. So if you think about, Michigan became a state in 1837, our first female keeper in 1849, and these women were being appointed in government jobs alongside of men, sometimes as the boss of men, and they were also making the same salary as men. And that's I don't know any other example of where we would see that type of opportunity for women, especially in that time period. Now, these women, the salary for a lighthouse keeper was not very big. Most of the keepers, men and women, started out and earned between $300 and $600 a year in the 1800s. Now, you also need to take into account that they were given a house to live in that they didn't have to pay rent for. They were given all the things that they needed to keep that house heated and to keep it up. So they didn't have those expenses. And when you're working in a lighthouse, you're pretty much working around the clock from April through December, or a little longer, depending on if it's a milder winter, particularly like we would see this year. So there wasn't a lot of time for travel or spending money, but really $500, let's say, a year for a lighthouse keeper. And if you ever climbed a lighthouse, you know that is a very strenuous job. Imagining doing that day in and day out, multiple times a day for years on end. No matter whether you're a man or a woman, that's a tough job. A little more tough for women because, men had an actual uniform. The women wore outfits of the day, which meant long black dresses with petticoats and all kinds of undergarments. So, can you imagine them having to climb a tower, carrying a pail of hot oil, which weighed about 50 pounds, 40 or 50 pounds empty, up those stairs, having to hike up their skirt? They probably had a little bit of a heel to their shoe from that era, and they had to do that job day in and day out. So it was quite a job. Let's say they really earned every penny that they were paid. Now, for comparison's sake, in that same time period, a teacher would have made about the same salary, anywhere from $345 to $400, $500 a year. They often lived with families of their students, so they didn't have a lot of living expenses. But by comparison, also, a postmaster, another government job, a postmaster would receive $1,000 to $6,000 a year back in the 1800s, which I don't know that that's a terribly strenuous job. It's not even at that time probably mentally demanding. So I don't know what justified them getting paid so much more than lighthouse keepers, but that certainly was the case. All right. So enough of the background information. Let's meet some of these ladies. So this is a list of the women from Michigan that I have been able to determine from various sources. And today we're going to visit with about 20 of them. And those are the women, the names who are underlined and in bold. And this list is alphabetical, but we're going to travel geographically and ironically in your neighborhood at the White River Light Station in Whitehall. This is actually one of my favorite lights, also in my haunted book, if you're interested in that. This photograph was taken in the early 1900s, and your head keeper was Bill Robinson. He's the second from the right in this photograph, and his grandson William Bush is next to him. Bill came to the Whitehall area in the 1860s with his wife Sarah and 7 of their eventually 13 children. 3 of them died in childhood, but many of the other children stayed on in the Muskegon County area. Many of the men and the sons and grandsons went on to become lighthouse keepers themselves. But Sarah Robinson came in and she assisted Bill with the lighthouse duties when the light was activated in 1875, and he was named the very first keeper. In fact, he's credited with having the lighthouse built in the first place. When they came in the 1860s, there was no light, even though there was a tremendous amount of traffic coming in and out of the White River due to lumbering. This area is where a bulk of the lumber to rebuild Chicago after the Great Fire came from. So Bill was watching all these ships coming in and out, documenting them, keeping track of where they were going and what they were hauling and how much and who the captain was. And he was sending this information off to the lighthouse service as proof that this port needed to have a lighthouse. So when it was finally determined that they were going to build it, they hired him to manage the crew to do so. And then he was appointed the very first keeper. So 1876, the start of that season, he and Sarah moved into the lighthouse. She actually passed away in 1891 of a stroke. She was in her 50s. And the remaining children that were at home stayed around, helped Bill with the responsibilities. And as I said, many of the sons and grandsons went on to lighthouse service as well. Sarah and Bill are actually buried in the Mouth Cemetery in Montague. It's an interesting little cemetery if you've ever been out there. And it's kind of abandoned, but they have a family plot where they have been laid to rest. Now, actually, White River Light Station has 3 women significantly tied to its history at the lighthouse. And here we have Frances. Her maiden name was Gilmer, and this is her first husband, Leo Worry. And Leo was a Coast Guardsman, and they were serving in the mid-1940s. By the 1930s, the lighthouses in the country had been transferred over to the Coast Guard. And so instead of traditional government-appointed lighthouse keepers, they would often serve, have Coast Guardsmen serve. And then by the 50s, they were hiring civilians as needed. So Leo was actually the keeper of record. However, in an interview I read and listened to online, Frances herself said that he really did very little. He would rather hunt and fish, and so she took care of the light, and she also took care of cooking the meals and taking care of the lawn and the garden and everything else. Well, in around 1949, he retired from his service and he returned to the Upper Peninsula where he was from. And at that time, they divorced. But she then reapplied to be a keeper as a civilian keeper. She remarried a man by the name of Johnson, and so she served here for several years. Sadly, that marriage also ended in divorce, but then she got married again a 3rd time. But one of her big claims to fame in May of 1953, she was sent out to New York to be on the game show What's My Line? And these are some of her archived newspaper articles and photos, her Western Union Telegram, and a photograph from that episode. And I'll actually share the YouTube video of this in the chat at the end of the program, because it's really kind of fun to watch her stump the panel. They were able to determine that she was a government employee, but they could never guess that she was a lighthouse keeper in Whitehall, Michigan. So she won $50 for that presence on, on the game show, which was pretty fun. She married again in the 1990s, a man by the name of John Marshall. They called him Marv. And I met her probably 15 years ago. That photo on the bottom, I was presenting this very program, and she was the guest of honor. And it was really hard to follow her because she spoke ahead of time about her life at the light. And she was just this spunky lady. I thought she was so great. And she did an interview a few years ago before she passed away in 2011 with Channel 8 with Positively Michigan. And this is a shot of that interview. And she really was only there for a brief period of time, about 10 years, but it was really one of the greatest experiences of her life, she says. She retired. She had one daughter. Her name was Holly. And it was interesting because when I gave this presentation last week, Holly was in the program. She was watching and chimed in at the very end and was telling me how excited she was that her mom was, a lighthouse keeper, was being recognized for her years of service. The 3rd female keeper to come from Whitehall is Karen McDonald, and Karen's actually standing there next to Frances in that lower photograph. And Karen came in to the area in 1983 with her son She lived in they had divided it out into a duplex. And she lived there, and she became the curator and the historian for the light, taking care of it as a museum. And she held that position until 2012, when the light was transferred over to the Sable Point Lighthouse Keepers Association, which also manages Big Sable Point in Ludington, the Ludington North Breakwater, and the Little Sable Point Lighthouse in Mears. So making our way up the coastline to South Manitou Island. If you were not aware, South Manitou and North Manitou are both publicly accessible islands. They're part of the Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore, and you can take a ferry out from Leland, day trips to South Manitou Island, and they'll drop you off and let you roam the island for about 4 hours while they go up to North Manitou, drop off the overnight campers, pick up the new campers, and then come back and pick you up and take you to the mainland. In the 1860s, there were about 200 residents living on South Manitou Island, and you could see from this map that there are all these farmsteads that are located out there. Farming was their #1 activity there. They also had a cemetery, a one-room school. They had a Coast Guard station, of course, the lighthouse. And this is the deepest natural harbor in northern Lake Michigan. And so they saw quite a bit of vessel traffic here, particularly ships traveling between Chicago and Detroit in inclement weather. Those ships could kind of come into this harbor and take refuge if the waves were really bad, or if other conditions warranted it. They could also pick up supplies. You could buy cordwood there if you needed to. The lighthouses were manned by several different people over the history, and one of the more noted families was the Sheridan family. And this is Aaron Sheridan. He was a Civil War soldier, and his wife, Julia. Now, Civil War soldiers were often appointed as lighthouse keepers, not just here in Michigan, but along even the ocean coastlines. And Julia assisted him. She was an official assistant keeper. Aaron lost the use of his arm in battle, and so he had difficulty doing some of the responsibilities. And because this tower was incredibly tall, I think it's like 117 steps to the top, and because of the importance of this harbor, with a deep harbor there in its location in the south of the Straits of Mackinac, it was very important. And so Aaron was the head keeper. He made a salary of about $350. Julia made about $150, so about $500 for the family. They raised 6 sons during the 12 years that they were at this lighthouse. And everything was going pretty well for the family until March 15th of 1878. And that anniversary is actually coming up on Monday. That day, Aaron, and you can see here in this photograph how his left hand is kind of just hanging there. Aaron and Julia had hired this other gentleman in the photograph. His name was Christian Ankerson, to sail them across to the mainland, either to Glen Arbor or Glen Haven. There are different reports on where their destination was. And they went in a boat similar to this Mackinac. It was about a 25-foot open air sailboat. The lighthouses had these as their keeper boats, but because he only had one arm, Aaron couldn't sail or run the sails himself. And Julia was occupied because she had with her their 9-month-old son, Robert. And we don't really know what the cause of the trip was to the mainland, whether it was official lighthouse business and both Aaron and Julia needed to be there. I seem to think it might have been more personal in nature, in that Julia needed to take Robert to the doctor, because I really can't imagine a mother, even a nursing mother, taking an infant across the Lake Michigan, in an open-air sailboat in March. Would you go across there with a baby right now? I mean, and this is a mild winter here, so I don't really know what the weather conditions were in 1878, But in any case, on the return trip, the boat capsized, and Aaron and Julia and Robert all drowned that day. Christian did survive. He actually clung to the overturned boat, and he was rescued the next day. There was an inquisition, and it was determined that it was a total accident, and he was not at fault in any way. And so he was cleared of any wrongdoing. The 5 remaining brothers, who I think the youngest was probably 3 and the oldest was a teenager, they were sent to live with other relatives throughout the Great Lakes region. Ironically, their second oldest son, George, went on to become a lighthouse keeper himself. This is a photograph of George with 2 of his 3 children, and he was the only officially trained lighthouse keeper to serve at the Kalamazoo River Light from 1900 to 1914, when the lighthouse was decommissioned. And he had been at a couple other lights prior to that. In 1914, they were getting ready to decommission this. He was actually scheduled to transfer to another light in southern Lake Michigan, but things became a little challenging for him. He had actually suffered with depression and mental illness most of his life after what happened to his parents and his brother. So he checked himself into an asylum to be treated for that depression. And in part of that, he was then fired and not able to serve at the new light. And so it was very challenging for him at this point. And his wife was also, I guess, ending the marriage. She was not going to go with him to transfer to the new lighthouse. She was going to stay on in Saugatuck. And so after he got out of the asylum, George went to visit a cousin of his who was the keeper at the Grosse Point Light in Evanston, Illinois, and he hung himself there. So it was quite a tragedy. Sarah, his wife, Sarah Unwin Sheridan, she was the one who signed the official papers to close that lighthouse down in 1914, 1915, because he was gone at that point, away from the lighthouse service. She ended up staying on in Saugatuck. This photograph of her fishing is actually a new one that I just acquired today from the Saugatuck Douglas Historical Society. She stayed on in Saugatuck and was very well respected. She lived in this house, which was later turned into the Lighthouse Keeper gift shop. And she raised her 3 children there. These are her grandchildren. And many of the keepers of lights in the area also took up collections and made sure that she had the money she needed to take care of her children. She also took in laundry to make ends meet. But the Sheridans descendants are still in this area of Saugatuck. Jack Sheridan is a grandson, and he is involved with the Saugatuck Douglas Historical Society. He provides a lot of information and photographs to me. His brother, Stephen Sheridan, was an Allegan County judge, and they both have written about the family history in that area as well. These are images that I found on findagrave.com today. Her headstone and little bit of information about her involvement in the local town, member of the Congregational Church, loved to watch the comings and goings of the village from her rocking chair on the front porch of her home on Culver Street in downtown Saugatuck. This is Sarah Lane and her daughter Minnie as a child and then as an adult. And Sarah and her husband John started their service down in the southeast part of the state at the St. Clair South Channel Range Lights. And so they lived in the larger lighthouse with the dwelling. And then they also took care of the range light, which was spaced out about 1,000 feet. And so they would have to take a boat to go out to that light every day, several times a day, make sure that the lens had oil, whether that was whale oil or lard. made sure that the wick was trimmed, that the glass of the tower was polished, the Fresnel lens was polished. So they would go back and forth. And because there were two lights, Sarah was an assistant keeper with her husband at that light. They then transferred from here on up in the 1870s to the old Mission Point Lighthouse in Traverse City. And John was first hired as an assistant keeper and then quickly promoted to the primary keeper in 1883. However, he was ill the latter part of his service. And so Sarah did much of the responsibilities, even though she was not necessarily officially recognized as the keeper in charge. This is a great article that I found from the Grand Rapids News from 1905. And I love the fact that the newspaper reporters were talking about these women over 100 years ago, sharing their stories and talking about, you know, their responsibilities and their passion for their jobs. And this is a great article because in it, Sarah talks about how one particular night there was a big storm and she had gone up to the top of the tower to check on the lens and make sure that the light was shining. Because, you know, while the lighthouses are beautiful, particularly on a sunny day, they're really there to serve mariners during tragic weather conditions. And so on this particular night, she was going up to the lantern room to check on the light. And if you've ever climbed a light, you know, when you get to the top lantern room, it's, you know, the metal floor, and there's a like a trap door that opens up, and then you climb up the last few steps to the lens. So this particular night, I don't know if it was just so windy or if the lantern room wasn't particularly windproof, but she flipped open that door and she put her hand on the floor to kind of pull herself up, and the wind whipped around and brought that door down on her hand, and it chopped off part of her finger. Well, in this article, she talks about how she doesn't even realize that this has happened. She gets up there, she takes care of the lens, and after she's gotten the job done, she looks down and realizes there's blood everywhere. And that part of her finger's gone. And she says the thing to do would have been to faint away, but she had a job to do. So she didn't have time for that, you know, that finger situation. So she got the job done. Then she went downstairs and dealt with her finger. And that really just shows you the level of dedication that these lighthouse keepers have to their jobs. They weren't necessarily just jobs. It was their calling. And she was a great example of that. This is the St. James Harbor Light at Whiskey Point. It's located on Beaver Island. It's actually one of two lighthouses on Beaver Island. This one is in the community of St. James. The second light is on the south end of the island. And here we have, in that lower photograph, our two youngest female lighthouse keepers, Effie and Mary McKinley. Now, they were not that age when they were serving as keepers. That's their father, Peter McKinley, and he was the head keeper in the 1860s. And toward the latter part of his service, he was ill, and so they stepped up and helped out with the duties. And this was what the families did at every lighthouse. Because if the head keeper is sick or injured and the family doesn't help, the keeper loses his job. And then he loses his salary. And then he loses his house. So the family had to step up and help out. It was a family business to make sure that the lighthouse duties were taken care of, no matter what. And so that's what these young girls did for their father. He ended up retiring, and in 1869, Elizabeth Whitney was her maiden name. Van Riper came in as the wife of Clement Van Riper, and he was appointed the head keeper. And she has a wonderful autobiography called A Child of the Sea and Life Among Mormons. And if you're not familiar with Beaver Island history, at this time period in the 1860s, there was a huge Mormon population on the island. And it was the congregation led by a self-proclaimed king named James Strang. And she talks about in her biography about growing up during this time, during the Mormon times out here on the island, and also toward the end of the book, talking about their time at the lighthouse. 3 years into the service, a shipwreck happens in the harbor there. It's the Thomas Howland. And Clement goes out to try and assist the crew, and he ends up drowning as a result of that accident. And she says in her book that there really is nothing that compares to losing a loved one by drowning and never being able to recover the remains. She says it's a sorrow that never ends through time. And because of that accident with her husband, and the fact that she'd also lost 2 brothers to shipwreck accidents in the Great Lakes, she felt it was her duty, her calling, her responsibility to step up and serve as a lighthouse keeper and try to prevent that situation from happening to other people, from them from dying, but also to protect other people like herself, other family members, from having to go through the sorrow of losing someone on the Great Lakes. So she petitions the U.S. Lighthouse Service, and she is given the appointment as the head keeper. Very common for the wife of a deceased male keeper to receive that appointment. So she stays there until 1884. So she comes in 1872. She's there 12 years. And then she, at that same time, remarries a man by the name of Daniel Williams. And in 1884, she decides she wants to transfer to a mainland lighthouse. And this light in Harbor Springs, the Little Traverse Light, had just been completed, and she was appointed the very first keeper. So here we have a picture of it, the smaller picture of it as you're coming in Harbor Point into Little Traverse Harbor. And then the other photograph is from the backside of the lighthouse. And she is just ecstatic about this new job. She and Daniel, she never had any children with either husband, but she and Daniel host gatherings on the lawn. They host musical concerts inside the lighthouse, and they're very well respected by the folks here in Harbor Springs. Now, Harbor Point is actually a very exclusive area of Harbor Springs. It's gated. There are no cars allowed, so the people that live there actually are taken to their cottages, and I use the word cottages loosely. They're lakeside mansions, really, from the 1800s. And so it's a really great life for her. They really enjoy their service, and they end up staying here at this light until about 1913. She retires at the age of 69. And at this point, they move into Charlevoix, but she has served 44 years as a lighthouse keeper. I have been trying for about 10 years now to get her inducted into the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame. Last year, she made the semifinal round, so I'm getting ready this weekend to send this year's application in. Maybe she'll make it this year. But 44 years and one of the longest serving female keepers in the state of Michigan, one of the longest serving keepers, regardless of gender, in Michigan as well. So they actually, Elizabeth and Daniel actually die within 28 hours, 24 to 28 hours of each other. in January of 1938. She was 94 years old. And they are buried at the Brookside Cemetery in Charlevoix. The cause of death for both of them is listed as senility. And he would have been, I think he was, oh, wow. She was older than him. Good girl. So she was 93 and a half. He was, looks like 86 and a half. But they're buried at the cemetery there in Charlevoix. Squaw Point Lighthouse, and the second keeper here was Lemuel Marvin. And after he passed away in 1897, his wife, Catherine, they called her Kate, came in and she served at the light until 1904. She had 10 children. 5 of them were still living at home by the time she took over service of the lighthouse. And so they would have assisted her in those duties. She stayed on there for 6 years before retiring and then remarrying and moving away from the lighthouse. The Sand Point Lighthouse in Escanaba was completed in 1868. And the very first lighthouse keeper appointed to this light was a man by the name of John Terry. But he actually passed away between the time he was hired and the time the light was completed. And so his wife, Mary Terry, was given the job. And she served here without fail for 18 years. And they never had any children. So she, as far as I know, lived and worked there by herself during her service. And in 1886, actually March 5th, which would have been last anniversary of this would have been last week, little after midnight, there was a fire at the lighthouse and she died in that fire. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to come back to that one in a second. There is a mystery at the Sand Point Lighthouse, and Michigan History Magazine actually did a large, 6 or 7 page spread on this back in the early 2000s about the story. And it is still a mystery to this day. The fire occurred in the basement of the lighthouse. Let me go back right here. So if you see where the stairs are there to the lower level, that's where the fire occurred. That's where Mary's body was found. The fire was just after midnight. She should have been upstairs in her bedroom. And so there's a lot of theory as to what happened that night. And one of those is that it was simply an accident, that there was a chimney fire, which was in the basement, and that she went downstairs to try to put the fire out and died as a result of that fire. But there's also a theory that someone broke into the lighthouse and she heard this. And when she went to investigate, there was a struggle between her and the intruder. She was killed, and the fire was started to make it look like she died accidentally. And one of the big pieces of evidence on this was that door to that lower level, even though the lighthouse was totally destroyed by the fire, they could tell that the door had been kicked in. It was hanging off of its hinges, as if somebody had kicked it from the outside to get entry into the light. And the fire was so severe that there was very little left of her after that. They were able to put it all out. And so even in some of these early newspaper articles, and there were about a dozen of them over the course of a month or two, they talk about robbery and murder as a possible cause of her death. So this is a mystery that remains. Her story is one of the ones that'll be in my next book, which is about lighthouse keepers in the Great Lakes who died under mysterious and tragic circumstances. Now we're going to pop outside of Michigan briefly to the Apostle Islands and Lake Superior. These are technically in Wisconsin territory, But the family I'm going to introduce you to real quickly has ties to several other lights on Lake Superior that actually are in Michigan. So this is Muskegon Island, and here is what the lighthouse looked like at this light back in the 1890s, at the time that Robert Carlson was the head keeper. And his official assistant keeper was his brother, and Anna Maria was his wife, and these are their children. This is Cecilia, the little girl, and twin brothers, Robert and Carl. And on this one particular winter in the late 1890s, they decided instead of going to a mainland light for the winter that they would stay on in Michigan City. And this they actually allowed keepers to do if they chose. If it was not a populated island, they had the option to go stay at another location for the winter and then come back in the spring to start the service, or they could stay at the light during the winter if they chose. So Anna Maria says in this article published in one of the Detroit papers in the 1930s that they decided to stay on this one winter. She was quite disappointed because their hired girl, who was there to help with the children, ran away with some fishermen and never came back. So she was left at the light by herself to take care of the children, to take care of their dogs, to take care of the cooking and the cleaning and other responsibilities in order to assist her husband. On one particular day, Robert and his brother took the dogs and went fishing. And at the end of the day, when they didn't come back, Anna went into a state of kind of distress. They did not return the second night or the third night. And she was beside herself. She was from Chicago. So she really had not a lot of experience living on a remote island light in Lake Superior. She didn't know how to milk the cow. So she had to figure that out. And it was really a rough few days for her while also trying to take care of the children. On the fourth day, the men finally made it back. And this is kind of what the winter would have looked like during that time period. And this is actually another lighthouse in the Apostle Islands, but I wanted to just show you what what the snowy conditions looked like in this area at that time. What they determined was that Robert and his brother had been fishing on the edge of Muskegon Island, and the section of ice that they were standing on broke off and drifted down to MADL Island. And when they got there, they had to scrounge around on MADL Island, and they found flowers somewhere and melted snow, and they made a gruel that they were able to eat to stay alive for the 3 days that they were there. They also found an old boat that had a hole in it, but they were able to find the supplies in order to patch it up. And then they rode 8 miles back across stormy, icy Lake Superior waters to get back to Muskegon Island and to the family. And in the 1930s, after they retired from their service, she told the story about these 4 days of terror to the Detroit News, and it was a section feature, and I think it spread out for two full pages in the newspaper with accounts of their winter. She says they never tried to stay on an island for the winter ever again. So after they got done at Muskegon Island, they went on over and served from 1898 to 1903 at the Marquette Harbor Lighthouse. Then they served at Whitefish Point, and they were here for the longest stretch, 1903 to 1931. And while they were there, they also were taking care of their grandchildren, and that's the children here. That is, so their oldest daughter, Cecilia, These are her children, Bertha and Robert. Now, Cecilia was a teenage bride and ultimately a teenage mother. She married a man, then she divorced him, then she married him again, and then I have some census data that shows that they rarely lived together, but they had these two children together. The boy was born after the divorce and the second marriage, but Cecilia actually spent the last 18 years of her life at the asylum in Newberry, where she died of tuberculosis. And her husband, after the divorce, took off. And so Anna Maria and Robert were in charge of their grandchildren. And Bertha actually lived into her 90s and was very active at Whitefish Point in her life. She was involved in the restoration of the lighthouse there. She was involved in the project that turned this campus into the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum. Of course, this is where the Edmund Fitzgerald went down, and so she would have been around at that time. And she also donated a lot of her family artifacts to the museum. So if you go through the lighthouse at Whitefish Point, I think it's the dining room has several Carlson artifacts, and those were donated by Bertha to the museum. Now, Bertha also is, this story in greater detail is also in my book, because a paranormal group has determined that Bertha's ghost remains in her childhood bedroom at that lighthouse. And ironically, the Marquette Lighthouse is also haunted by a young girl, and I believe it's her mother, the ghost of her mother, Cecilia, at that light. So more details on that in the book. So we're going to backtrack a little bit geographically, because we were sticking with the Carlsons there for a moment. But the Eagle Harbor Range Light, this is in the Keweenaw Peninsula. And Mary Ann Wheatley, she served as a keeper. Several members of the Wheatley family actually served at various lights in this particular area of the Keweenaw Peninsula. Her husband was William Henry Wheatley, and he was the keeper at Granite Island Lighthouse. And then he transferred to Marquette, and then he actually died in 1898 in a shipwreck accident. And it was about 6 weeks later that Mary was appointed the keeper of the Eagle Harbor Range Lighthouse, and she served from 1898 until 1905. And they have a nice little display to her inside of that lighthouse. Now, this is Manitou Island Light. You'll notice very similar looking to Whitefish Point. And then we have the Gull Rock Lighthouse, and these are both in that that area of Lake Superior up near the Keweenaw. And Mary Corrigan actually served back and forth between a couple different lighthouses in this area. She was an assistant keeper to her husband, James, who was at Gull Rock from 1877 to 1888. And then she went to, she was also part-time at Manitou Island Light from 1873 to 1875. And there's an interesting story, probably, gosh, closer to 20 years now. I emailed the Keweenaw Land Trust looking for information and photographs of the Corrigan family. And I was lucky enough that the person who answered my email was a descendant of the family. And you don't get that very often, but it was really great. And so he provided a variety of stories. And one of the ones that he told me was that when Mary was pregnant with her second oldest son, James, who they called Bud, in the 1870s, that she had gone from, I believe it was Gull Rock, to the mainland. They were putting her on a boat to the mainland so that she could meet up with a midwife and have the baby. Well, the baby was born on the boat. And so the story I was told was that she instructed the captain of the boat to turn the boat around, take her back to the light, to her island, because she had work to do. So again, just reinforcing These women were doing it all. They were multitaskers. They were lighthouse keepers, and they were cooks, and they were gardeners, and they were mothers, and they were maids. They were doing all of it back even in the 1800s. This is another exciting story that I just uncovered within the last 6 months, to a certain degree, the photographs, I mean. So I had heard about Henrietta Berg at the Beta Green Bay area in the Keweenaw Peninsula years ago. And last summer, I was doing some searching online and I came across a blog post written by a woman named Nora. And it turns out that Nora is the great-great-granddaughter of Henrietta Berg. And she had these next two photos I'm going to show you. And the story is that Henrietta and her husband owned an island off of the Keweenaw. They called it Berg Island. Today, I think it's called Rabbit Island. And then they had this house, which was on the mainland. Well, they were fishers. And so her husband would often go out at night, go fishing, and he would ask Henrietta there, who's in the red circle, to please put a lantern in the upper window of their home so that when he came home after dark, he would know where the house was and he could get back safely. Well, it didn't take long before the other fishermen in the area started asking Henrietta to do the same for them. So she began putting the light out almost every night during the fishing season for these fishermen. Now, this isn't an official light and she isn't an official keeper, but she predates the building of the lighthouse in this area. Here we have another photograph of her inside their home. And then eventually the Mendota Lighthouse, or the Beta Green Bay Lighthouse, was built. It did not operate for very long. And last summer, I was actually in the Keweenaw. We were going to go and tour it, but it had just sold. I don't know what the purchase price was, but the listing price was $495,000. They have a new website. It's a nice site and it has information. So if you're going past this area and you want to take a tour, you can email and they will supposedly arrange for you to tour the lighthouse. So we're back to Marquette. Sorry for all the bouncing around there. It gets a little goofy in that island area. So in addition to the Carlsons who were there, prior to that time period, back in the 1860s, Anastasia Merker Truckee was serving as the lighthouse keeper from 1861 to 1865, while her husband Nelson here was off serving in the Civil War. And she had quite a good reputation in town. The Native Americans called her Mother of the Light. And this is a copy of a letter that I received in 2001 from one of her descendants, a woman by the name of Chris Shanley Dillman, who is the great-great-great-granddaughter of Anastasia. They called her Eliza Truckee. And this is written by one of Chris's relatives on her paternal side, I believe. And I actually just dug this out and scanned these images today because I can tell some of the stories, but it's really kind of cool to see the handwriting and the family telling these stories. But the Native Americans called her Mother of the Light, and she had quite a reputation. And in fact, there's a story in this letter that talks about how a visiting relative had gotten into an argument with a local Native American, and Eliza had come in and calmed things down. And as a result, the relative was allowed to keep his scalp. He did not lose his scalp as a result of that confrontation. They had a couple of children, one of which was Frances Emma, who married Alex Shanley. So this is the line that the Chris Shanley Dillman's history comes from. And Christine actually wrote a book called Finding My Light, and it's based on Emma's life as a teenager growing up at the Marquette Lighthouse during the Civil War. And so it's a historical novel based on the true accounts from her family history. And now we're over to Lake Huron, our last handful of lighthouses here. This is the old Presqu'île Lighthouse. And this light and the new light that was built there, as well as the range lights, they're actually, this tiny little community has 4 lighthouses. And one of the most noted families to serve there was the Garrity family. Mary Garrity on the left, that's the mother. She was married to Patrick Garrity, and Patrick Garrity Sr., and they were the last keepers at the old lighthouse and the first keepers at the new house. Their sons, Thomas, John, and Patrick Jr., all tended lighthouses in the area as well. And even their daughter, Anna here, she served at the range light. You'll notice that looks very similar to the light in Eagle Harbor. So she was responsible for this, which was the rear light, and then the light out closer to the water. And she had some assistance with this from one of her brothers. So often the family would kind of bop back and forth between all the various lights to make sure they were all taken care of. And here we have also a metal sculpture of Anna outside of the range light there. In the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, there was a more modern caretaker of the light. The old light was actually decommissioned in about 30 years after service when they built a new lighthouse up the shoreline. And so in the 70s, Lorraine Paris and her husband George were brought in as caretakers. They ran the museum. It was a historical attraction in the community. And they were there for about 20 years before George passed away. She stayed on for several years past that. And I believe she's going to be 92 this year. I saw her the last about 5 years ago. She came to one of my presentations. This lighthouse is also haunted. And I did a presentation at dusk out there one night. And she came and sat right in the front row wearing that exact same outfit that she was wearing like 20 years ago when I met her. Another spunky lady with just all kinds of great stories. Now, this is the new Presqu'île light. This is the light that replaced the old light. It's built just about a mile up the road. They're all managed by the same Park Service now. So this was where Patrick and Mary Garrity went after the old light was decommissioned. They became the first keepers of this lighthouse. The Saginaw River Range Light is located on the Saginaw River, Saginaw Bay in Bay City. It's currently owned by Dow Chemical, and it is maintained by the Saginaw River Marine Historical Society. The first keeper here was Peter Braun. He's the gentleman at the top. And he and his wife, Julia, came in 1866. And they had their son, DeWitt. I think he was their youngest child. And shortly after they arrived, Peter fell ill and was bedridden for the better part of 9 years. And during that time, Julia and DeWitt did as was expected of them. They took care of the lighthouse and did all the responsibilities in order to maintain that post and the salary for the family. Peter passed away in March of 1873, March 18th. And at that point, Julia was appointed as the head keeper, officially recognized as a keeper with the Lighthouse Service. 2 years after that, she remarried in what the locals tell me was a scandalous marriage because her new husband was 13 years younger than she was. And shortly after that marriage, her second husband, George Way, was promoted and put in the position of the head keeper, which was interesting because he had no experience in lighthouse keeping. And so at that point, Julia was demoted. And then just a little bit after that, they actually abolished her position altogether. And there's some question as to whether they were trying to force the family out. But shortly after she was demoted and lost her job, George died. And after that, she and DeWitt kind of left the Lighthouse service. For many years, I always questioned whether she had anything to do with the deaths of those husbands, because first of all, she looks kind of sinister. But I did go, when I was researching it, this is also in my book. And one of the husbands died of prostate cancer, and I don't recall what the other one died from. So clearly she didn't have anything to do with that. And she was actually very well respected in her community. She's buried in the cemetery between her two husbands. And it's interesting that her headstone still says Braun, even though George Way is buried there with her, and her name would have been Way by the time she died. I haven't quite figured out the logistics of that headstone with that family quite yet. Still have to work on that one. This is the Point on Barks Lighthouse. This is an illustration of what the earliest lighthouse would have looked like. And this is where our first female keeper hails from, Catherine Shook. And she was the wife of Keeper Peter Shook. And Peter died in a shipwreck accident on Lake Huron while taking a doctor who had been there actually to take care of Catherine, Dr. Heath, back to his office in Port Huron. Now, in the 1840s, the roads were virtually non-existent in this area. And if you were they were okay for horseback, but not for a carriage or a wagon. So it was much easier and quicker to go by water. However, if there's a shipwreck incident, then that's not so safe. Peter and the doctor both died that day. Their bodies were never recovered. And shortly after that, Catherine was appointed the keeper of the lighthouse, and she stayed on there. I think they had 8 children. This is a letter written not long after her husband's death, in which the lighthouse inspector showed up at the light and determined that there had been a fire at the light. The chimney of the dwelling was not in good shape, and a fire started in that. And Catherine was actually injured trying to put the fire out. And by the time the inspector got there, she was living in a lean-to on the property with the children. Thankfully, it was summer and the weather was accommodating for that. But they did an inspection and determined that it was not her fault and that it was a faulty chimney. And so the inspector ordered it to be repaired, ordered the house to be fixed, ordered the tower to be repainted, and to do it in a quick fashion because Catherine had just lost her husband and she was trying to care for herself and her children. Peter's body was never found, but he is listed on her headstone, and she is buried at a cemetery in New Baltimore. And then this is the Mama Judah light. And I have had a little bit of information about this light and one of its female keepers for a while, but just recently, an interesting story, the real family history of this light was presented to me. And actually, I spent about 6 hours yesterday searching online for archives and information. And so I'm excited. You're only the second group to get this information. So this is actually a lost lighthouse, and it was built in 1849 and rebuilt in 1866 in the Detroit River. And some say it was named, it's called Mama Judah, but some say it was named Mammy Judy after a Native American woman with the same name who lived in this area. The island itself was actually originally listed as Jones Island, and that's how it's recorded in some French maps that date back to the late 1700s. Now, this is the Lidigot family, and these are siblings. I don't have a picture of Safaria, who I believe was the oldest, but then we have John, Barney, and their youngest sister, Mary. And we don't really know or haven't been able to determine yet who their parents were, but there is an account that tells that their mother died during childbirth while giving birth to Mary. And that shortly after that, well, about 10 years after that, their father, who was a prominent farmer in the area, also passed away. But Mary was sent off to be taken care of by family members or friends of the family shortly after she was born, because a farmer with 3 sons really isn't equipped to take care of an infant daughter. Um, and so I did find records that she is noted at the age of 3 as the foster daughter to Patrick O'Hearn and his wife Margaret, and that she was an acknowledged child, which I think means maybe she was adopted by them at the age of 3. But we'll come back to her in just a second. John and Barney, those brothers actually ended up having a little bit of a significant history. Sarah Safaria, the only thing I was able to find out about him was that he had a lawsuit in the 1870s when he sued a man for taking off with his wife. Barney actually got married in 1861 to a woman named Caroline Amelia Taylor. And the following year, Barney and John enlisted in the Civil War. They were in the Michigan 24th Infantry, Company K. And they mustered out of Detroit in August of 1862. John died in the very first battle that they fought together at, which was in Fredericksburg, Virginia, in the middle of December of 1862. And Barney himself continued on serving for several more years. In the Civil War, he was involved in the Battle of Wilderness, the Battle of Spotsville, the Cold Harbor Battle, and Gettysburg, where he lost a couple fingers on his right hand. Now, Barney mustered out in June of 1865. He was a sergeant, returned back home as a farmer, a husband, and a father. He and his wife, Caroline, had 5 children, although only 2 of them lived into adulthood. But in 1873, Barney was appointed, as other Civil War soldiers were, as a lighthouse keeper. He served at the Mama Judah Lighthouse. However, he died 9 months later, just 2 days before Christmas. And he is buried at the Oakdale Cemetery in Taylor Township. And after he died, Caroline became the keeper. She was supposed to be just an interim keeper until they could find an official keeper. But there was quite a bit of support for her from lighthouse keepers in the area, who actually sent letters to the U.S. Lighthouse Service requesting that she be appointed as the permanent keeper. And so that process took a couple of years, but in 1876, she was appointed. She was making $520 a year, and she held that position for 11 years and resigned in 1885, and then got remarried. So Barney, as I said, is buried in the Oakdale Cemetery. It's also called the Sandhill Cemetery. And he's actually recognized on this historical marker, which is at the cemetery, for his service in Gettysburg. And Caroline actually passed away in 1903, and she's buried with her second husband at the Woodmere Cemetery in Detroit. Now, I haven't forgotten about the young sister, Mary. And this is where the family tree takes an interesting turn. As I mentioned, Mary was 3 years old. She was adopted by another local family. Her father was still alive at that point, her biological father. And her father had 240 acres of farmland in the southeast part of the state of Michigan. And there was a gentleman who worked for him by the name of William Ford. And William Ford eventually acquired some acreage from her father. And eventually Mary Litigott married William Ford. They had 5 children during the course of their marriage. The first was Henry Ford. And so we have now legendary auto guy, Henry Ford, is the nephew of Barney and Caroline Litigott, who were the lighthouse keepers at the Mama Judah Lighthouse. And I knew enough about Caroline before. I had her name, I had her husband, both of her husband's names, and I had her years of service. But I never knew the connection to Henry Ford until just recently. And I think it's just a really neat little tidbit, and one that we're going to end the program on this evening. Now, if you're interested in more information about female lighthouse keepers, here are some resources for you. And many of these are probably available at the library there, or certainly through interlibrary loan. The first book that I read that really hooked me on the female keepers was Women Who Kept the Lights, there on the top row. That book was written by a mother-daughter team, the last name of Clifford. They're very active in the U.S. Lighthouse Service, and so if you, I'll give you a website here in a minute. They have a lot of information and historical data that they help catalog, from keepers to ships to lighthouses in general. Fred Stonehouse is probably one of the most noted maritime historians and authors in Michigan, and his Women in the Lakes 1 and 2 are great resources. Fred has been a longtime friend, provided me some quotes and information for my first book, and also just recently sent me some information for my second book. I mentioned Finding My Light already, and A Child of the Sea. There's also a book about Elizabeth Whitney Williams at the Little Traverse Light, as it's a children's book that's nice. And we have Mind and Light Katie. And then the most recent book is, you'll notice a familiar title, called Ladies of the Lights, and it's written by my friend Patricia Major. And Patricia used to run the Michigan Women's Historical Society and Hall of Fame, which has a new name now. She had an exhibit about female lighthouse keepers, I think in the early 2000s, and I gave this presentation, and we sat down at lunch afterward and started to talk about the ladies and the history. And she asked permission to use my title for her book. And then I shared with her the information that I had collected at that point. And then she went out and found a ton more and put this beautiful book together. And it's really nice because she's got a little paragraph in there thanking me for helping her out. This was back before I ever thought about writing a book myself. But speaking of my book, there that is. It was interesting. I didn't really set out to pick lighthouses for the haunted stories that were tied to female keepers, but 7 of the 13 lights in the book happen to have female keepers. So it's kind of an interesting little tie-in, and you'll see some of those noticed in that map. And I'll put the link in the chat afterward as well if you're interested in purchasing an autographed copy of that. Happy to put one in the mail to you. And then these are resources that I use almost on a daily basis when I am researching, whether it's for my book or for an article or for a presentation. And because new information is always coming out there, so I'm always looking for things that are new. The Great Lakes Lighthouse Keepers Association, which is based in Mackinac City, terrypepper.com. And Terry used to be the president of GLICA. He passed away in February of 2019, but they've keeping his website up because it has so much valuable information. And then the Lighthouse Research Catalog at the U.S. Lighthouse Service, that's where the Cliffords have put a bunch of their information there. And you can go through and search that as well. But I will put all of those links in the chat here when we wrap up momentarily as well. And if you are interested, you can click on those and open them up in your browser and then check them out at your leisure. And then I'll also be sure to put in that video. I really suggest you watch that Francis Johnson Marshall video from What's My Line. Really kind of a fascinating look, especially if you're not familiar with the TV show at all, and just how she is able to stump that panel and win herself that $50 prize at the end. So I'm going to stop the screen share, and then we'll pop into the chat for Q&A, or at that point, if you have a question and you want to unmute, you're welcome to chat verbally with me as well. So thank you for letting me share these stories. I'm pretty proud of these women that we've had in our service over the years.
Thank you so much, Dianna. That was really, really interesting. While I'm waiting to see if some questions come into the chat, or if you want to just unmute, just kind of wave your hand so I can call you by name and we can take questions that way. But I have a question while we're waiting. You mentioned about nominating the one lightkeeper, and I apologize, I don't remember her name, but who had the 44
Yes,
years.
Elizabeth.
Right. And you're going to try again this year. Is there any other keepers currently in the
There is not. And she's the longest serving in Michigan, which is why I chose her over any of the other women. And I think I think that their exhibit was in 2008, and I might have started to nominate her shortly after that. And last year was the closest that I ever got, was the semifinal round. So I'm basically just going to take the email that I sent last year, change the date on my letter, and send it out and see if that plays out this time around.
Right. Getting lots of thanks here in the chat. Lots of thank yous for a very interesting presentation. I did have another question for you while we're waiting to see, but you sort of answered it, but I was just curious, in terms of your interest in lighthouses, was it the haunted nature that appealed to you first, or were you researching the women first, the women keepers?
I think it was the haunted ones that kind of caught my attention first, but I think it popped up a little bit more. I had to dig a little harder for the female stories, but I think that the female stories really resonate in a very different way, given that they were so ahead of their time and they were such pioneers. I couldn't do it. I mean, I get winded, go up and down a flight of those stairs once. I can't imagine. I'd like to know what their calves were like, because they probably were really in shape. But you know, you look at it and go, oh, it'd be so romantic to live in a lighthouse. It'd be so wonderful. And I'd be like, oh, I don't know about that, doing that all day in and day out. So, so somebody, I was just gonna say, Susan says that she volunteers at the St. Helena. We went out there a couple of years ago and spent the day touring around the light. And I'm actually researching, it's not exactly a death related to that light, but one of the former keepers, Mr. Marshall, who hung upside down while painting the tower, got flipped upside down and it messed up his head, and he ended up living the rest of his life at the asylum in Traverse City. And so trying to decide if his story will be in the next book. So many just bizarre stories out there all over the place. And I know, obviously, being in Muskegon County, often I will have descendants of the Robinson family. There was a big family. I mean, there's many of them still around. And I've actually had descendants in the Detroit area come to presentations in the past. So
another question I had thinking about women keepers was, I often think of keepers, lighthouse keepers, were they ever responsible for doing any life saving? Like
they were. Sometimes the port had a life-saving station in addition. So for example, South Manitou had a Coast Guard life-saving station and the lighthouse. And in that case, the Coast Guard was the main group in charge of rescue attempts, but the keeper would assist if needed. You know, that's certainly how Clement Van Riper died on Beaver Island. And Frances Johnson in Whitehall talked in this interview that I just watched today about how she saved many lives, just mainly from people getting caught up in the current or the riptide of the lake and not realizing it and having to go out and rescue them. And this story was pretty funny because she talks about one woman she tried to save, and she had to punch the woman in the face because she kept clinging to her, and they were both going to die if she didn't calm her down. And so there are many chances, or many instances where they would have had to help with that if there was not an active Coast Guard station nearby.
Another big job that it's hard to imagine doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Frances Johnson was the last active female keeper to serve, and she retired in the 50s. You know, about that time, they began automating most of the lights. And you may have had, then if it's a museum, you've got a curator living there. But in terms of actually having to polish lenses, which when you're an electrified lens, you don't need to polish it like you do if it's a oil lens because the soot isn't gathering. So she was actually the last female keeper to work active service in Michigan.
Fascinating. I wanted to tell everybody tonight that Dianna shared the cover of her Haunted Lighthouse, Michigan's Haunted Lighthouses book. And I'm really hoping that in the future months coming up when we move out of our COVID stage, that we can have her in person and have her talk about that so that she can bring the book with her as well. So we're looking forward to hopefully making that happen as soon as we get back to some in-person programming.
Well, you know what? I've got a couple libraries that are starting, so I'm feeling like we're getting a little bit closer to the end of that tunnel.
Yeah, I think we are starting to see the light a little bit, and literally from the lighthouse, hopefully. The lighthouse of the vaccine, hopefully.
Yes.
So, well, thank you so much, Dianna. This was really, really interesting. And I want to thank everybody for attending tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. I thought it was so fascinating to learn about the incredible feats that these women did, and often many of them just stepping in to fill in for their spouses. I mean, who couldn't complete the job for whatever, but it certainly seemed to run in the family. So thank you again, Dianna, so much. And I also want to just remind everybody that the Muskegon Area District Library serves the Muskegon County area with our 10 local branches in the community. And we're also open 24/7 with access to many digital resources. So you can always like our Facebook page and subscribe to the YouTube channel to access the programming. And you can always visit the website at MADL.org for information on programs and signing up on the calendar. So thank you again, and have a lovely evening, everybody. Thank you, Dianna.
Yep, thank you.